Everyone, I'm Ben from FLAC, and welcome back to another installment of FLAC's Referendum Review Series. This week, we're heading back to 2015 to discuss the marriage equality referendum. This is the 34th Amendment of the Constitution, and it was the first time that a state legalised same-sex marriage by popular vote. We're joined by constitutional law expert Professor Oran Doyle, who's going to discuss the legal aspects of the referendum, as well as Q-Soc's Harmon, who's going to discuss his own experience of the referendum, as well as some of the legislative efforts he thinks we still need to make to achieve true equality. Thanks so much to our guests for participating, and I hope you enjoy.
So I'm very pleased to be asked to prepare this video about the same-sex marriage referendum for the series that FLAC is holding in relation to constitutional change. So I'm going to begin first by setting out some of the issues around the constitutionality of same-sex marriage. In 2006, the High Court held that there was no constitutional entitlement to same-sex marriage in the Zappone and Gilligan case. But this left open the question as to whether it was permissible for the Oireachtas to introduce same-sex marriage by legislation. Some people argued that this was possible, but there were some strong arguments against that as well. Although the word marriage wasn't defined in the Constitution, it was clearly located within a section of the Constitution, Article 41, that was animated by a real natural law vision of the family. Parents married, performing parenting functions according to traditional gender roles. So I think it was very clearly implicitly about opposite-sex marriage, and this was something that the Supreme Court had recognised on numerous occasions, stating that the marriage protected by the Constitution was marriage between a man and a woman. And this, I think, must have been to the forefront in leading the Attorney General to advise government that a constitutional referendum, an amendment, would be required to allow for same-sex marriage. Some academics disagree with this. They argue that legislation would have been permissible. I think that they are incorrect, that the Attorney General was right, that a referendum, an amendment was required. But I think in terms of assessing the political dynamics, the most important thing at this point is to recall that the political actors, the government, believed that an amendment was required and that therefore they were driven down the road of a same-sex marriage referendum in order to allow for same-sex marriage. So, in other words, the referendum wasn't a politically advantageous choice for them. Instead, it was a constitutional necessity if they were to bring about same-sex marriage, or so they believed at any rate. Around the same time as this legal debate was ongoing, there were also political moves afoot. Most importantly, the Civil Partnership Act 2010 allowed same-sex couples to register a civil partnership. This had many of the rights and entitlements of marriage, but not all of them, and also obviously wasn't called marriage. This could be seen in two different ways. So for some people, it was a valuable stepping stone towards marriage equality. For others, it was objectionable because it reflected the idea of separate but equal that animated segregation era US, and separate but equal can never be equal. So why put the gay people into a separate institution? They should have access to the same marriage as everyone else. And I think there was merit to both of those perspectives. In 2011, Fine Gael and Labour formed a coalition government. Labour had a manifesto commitment to marriage equality. Fine Gael didn't. It therefore suited the parties to put off a decision on the issue, and the matter was referred to the Constitutional Convention. 66 citizens, 33 politicians, one chairperson, deliberating across various issues of constitutional reform. In March 2013, 79% voted in favour of legalising same-sex marriage, and then later that year, at the end of the year, the government committed to a referendum on the issue in 2015. The amendment proposal took this rather conservative, natural law-influenced provision of the Constitution, Article 41, that I referred to earlier, and added in a new section. Marriage may be contracted in accordance with law by two persons without distinction as to their sex. This proposal was very clever legally, okay? It's not inspiring rhetoric, but what it does is it just alters the definition or the understanding of the existing marriage institution within the Constitution. So there can be no doubt, therefore, that same-sex couples can get married in the same way as everybody else. They're part of the same institution. There's no question of it being a different institution, and that's important. I want now to go on and look at the campaign, and I think it's helpful for this campaign in particular to think about it in terms of a public campaign and a private campaign. So the public campaign takes place on the airwaves in the media, and from the yes side really involves rather banal posters. Vote yes because marriage matters, vote yes for a fairer Ireland. Like, really, what does that mean? But it's just creating this general sort of feel-good sense and associations around the same-sex marriage proposal. The no side, in contrast, used very sharp and concise posters which managed to articulate the concerns that some people had around same-sex marriage. So the idea, well, we have civil partnerships already, why do we need to redefine marriage? We shouldn't be shifting the meaning of the words when there's already an adequate institution there. Also a heavy emphasis on opposite-sex parenting. Children deserve a mother and a father. And in particular, the role of mothers. The surrogacy issue came to the fore in that. And really, I think what's going on here is there is a subtext, which is that gay men are not to be trusted as parents, but it's not acceptable, it's not within the bounds of reasonable political debate by 2015 for the no side to say that. So instead, the message has to be framed more generally about the desirability of opposite-sex parenting and with a particular emphasis on mothers. But that perhaps rebounds somewhat for the no campaign because it makes it clear to people in general within society that their target, the target of the no campaign, is not limited to gay men. It in fact includes all people who don't conform to a very traditional model of parenting where you have two parents, mother and father, but the mother does most of the work. And certainly from speaking to people at the time, there were many fathers who found this very offensive, that they felt that they were important for their children too, that their children, that this huge emphasis on motherhood that the no campaign was going with was somewhat off-putting. Alongside the public campaign, there's the private campaign. This is the campaign of conversations, whether it be on the door in families, among friends, on the doorstep as you were canvassing, or on the streets as you were canvassing. I did canvass on behalf of marriage equality in the referendum, so part of what I'm drawing on here is my own experience of that campaign. And I think, in contrast to the public campaign, this was much more about real people. It was about gay people coming out to strangers, perhaps coming out to friends and family, telling their stories and explaining why, in light of their own experience, this referendum was so important to them. Their values that people spoke about in this private campaign, I think, were not so much about these general public and political values of equality and fairness, but were much more personal values such as kindness and generosity. So for some straight people, a feeling that they had benefited from this in society, this institution of marriage, and it reflected badly on them not to want to share it with others, that they should reach out and be generous and be kind. Also, I think from some straight people, a sense of atonement, both at a societal level and a personal level. Perhaps you would see social media posts where people were almost being apologetic for how they might have treated gay people in the past, and that it's really important now to vote in favour of this referendum. Partly, the word atonement wasn't used, this is my characterisation of it, but partly to atone for how they had behaved in the past. In talking to people who were opposed to the referendum, the biggest concern that I found was really one about the redefinition of marriage. I think there was just a sense that old certainties were being shifted. There was a word here that they thought they knew the meaning of, and the state was trying to tell them that they were wrong, that they didn't understand the meaning, and the state was going to change their meaning. So it was sort of a conservative, a traditionalist view, but just one of trying to, I think, hold on to something that they felt they knew and they understood. Other times that people would just not particularly want to engage with you, which was fine. There were some small elements of explicit anti-gay hostility. That was certainly there. But the point I'm trying to make is that wasn't all that was there, that there were things going on for people on the no side that weren't just about disliking gay people. At this point, I want to go back to this couple. You may remember them from the poster earlier where they were kissing their child and apparently supporting a no vote. It turns out that image of them earlier was a stock image that a friend had uploaded to a website and that the No campaign had purchased to use for their campaign. This couple, who were English, were slightly upset when they saw that their image was being used in that way, although there was nothing unlawful about this. They had signed away the rights to the image because they themselves supported marriage equality. So they did this poster for the yes side. This is a small news story in that campaign. It's not important in and of itself, but I think it captures a broader truth about the campaign that is important. And it goes back to this idea of real people. On the Yes campaign was particularly animated by the stories of real people, as channeled sometimes through the public campaign, but more often in that private campaign. The No side didn't really have real people to campaign on its behalf to tell their story. Maybe that was the character of the debate. And so instead what they had was a slick referendum campaign. A slick PR campaign. It was a campaign that was very well focused, very well thought out by a media company, but maybe it was too polished and maybe it ultimately didn't feel like a real political campaign. And I think the No side was at a significant disadvantage in that. The result of the referendum, on a turnout of 61%, carried by 62 to 38. Dublin, 70 to 75% yes. Then what you do is you see high votes in other urban centres and then getting closer and closer margins around the country until ultimately only one constituency votes no, which is Roscommon, Leitrim South, by a very narrow margin. So it's a ringing endorsement for marriage equality across the country, I think it is fair to say. The campaign allows us to draw some conclusions, or perhaps better, to articulate give some support for hypotheses about whether representative or popular political processes are better. The negatives of the referendum process were that it put the rights of a minority subject to a majority, and not just a majority in Parliament, but a majority at a popular referendum, which is much more rough and tumble, much more raw. This led to public dissection of people's private lives. So campaigners, in a sense, the merging of the private and public campaign, but really you could feel that their own personal lives, they were taking a public stand, a political stand, but this involved a dissection of their own personal and private life. And in a sense, perhaps this was seen as legitimising hostility towards gay people, because you could have No campaigners on TV articulating very negative positions, and this may have made it easier for those positions to be articulated in public. On the other hand, there were positives. This secured a really strong democratic mandate for marriage equality, much stronger than if it had been a court decision, and I think also stronger than if it had been just in Parliament, because here you have a broad public discussion. So everybody has had to think about it. They've had to reconsider their views. And if you're a gay person, you now know that 2/3 of the community at least are pretty much okay with you. And there may be others who felt perhaps they didn't want to vote for marriage equality, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily opposed to gay people. So I think it was positive in that sense of sort of public affirmation. whether you think the positives outweigh the negatives is perhaps the most important question that you should ask as you consider this process of constitutional change. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Adam Harmon. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a second year biology student in Trinity. But more importantly for this talk, I am the webmaster of the Q-Soc, Trinity's LGBTQA society. And I myself am an openly gay man, and I have been for around 4 years now. So I've been come here today to talk a bit about the marriage referendum, so the community's experiences at the time, and kind of looking back on it now 5 years after, and kind of reflecting on what has been done and what still hasn't been done, and kind of suggesting ways that still could be improved and other areas that still have to be added on before true equality can be met. So this is kind of moving a bit away from a purely legal point of view and kind of more of just a personal view of different people's experiences during the time. So I think to begin, I just kind of want to talk a bit about my own personal view at the time. So this is back in 2015 when the referendum went on. So back then I was in second year, so I was not out at that time. I think I was kind of just coming to terms with being gay, although I would not tell anyone about that because I was absolutely terrified about telling anyone in my school about that. I know that many other people, not just in my school but all over the country, felt the same way. And I remember particularly there is one of the no ads, and one of the key points that the no campaign ads was brought up was kind of talking about how this is like a slippery slope for Ireland, and that if marriage equality gets brought in, then there's going to be all these changes to how schools are run, and talking about how schools will have to implement discussion and education about same-sex issues and gender identity and sexuality, and basically talking about how all of this is a very much negative thing. And it kind of, when you're a 14-year-old and you're kind of coming to terms with who you are, it very much does make you feel that, oh, well, if they're all talking about this like it's a bad thing, does that mean that it is a bad thing that I'm feeling this way? Should I not be feeling this way? And I think personally that it made it a lot harder for me to kind of accept who I am and what I am, because of ideas. They're very much like even if it isn't spoken about, kind of a stigma about, oh yes, well, this is inferior, and being gay is inferior, being trans is just inferior and wrong, and there's something that shouldn't be done about it, when that's complete rubbish, to be honest. But my view is obviously going to be a bit of a biased view, because it is definitely much easier being a gay man in Dublin than, say, like a trans person in the countryside, where they might not have the same access to queer services, or being able to openly discuss certain issues in certain environments and areas. So obviously my experience is going to be different from many other people, and I think that's an important thing to mention. And I think a common issue about the referendum was that after a bit it did start to move away from talking purely about marriage and marriage equality. And one of the big things was it very much moved away from marriage and kind of moved towards talking about parenthood. And a lot of the no campaign, I remember the most popular poster that was all around the place was the "A child deserves a mother and a father" posters, which, from talking to same-sex parents and even just single parents, it very much gives off the impression that you are inferior, you are not as good, like you are inevitably going to be worse parents than a opposite sex couple. And it very much just creates a very negative image against them, and it can be very damaging towards them when the referendum was not to do with marriage, and that the equal allowing same-sex couples to adopt or to become legal parents of children was an entirely separate process to equal marriage, and it very much just kind of muddied the referendum and made it dirty by just bringing all of this into it. So I think that a lot of people do agree that the democratic process is very reliant on these discussions, especially when it is a constitutional change that requires a referendum. So I don't think many people will be denying that from a democratic point of view, it is very important to discuss these and vote on them. Although a lot of people in the community did very much feel very trivialized, as if like they have to prove themselves. They have to prove themselves to the rest of the country why they deserve to be treated well and why they deserve to have equal opportunity to marriage and to love who they want. And like they had to try and prove this to the country, and fingers crossed, hope that everyone will agree that they are now allowed to get married. And I remember a good ad that kind of highlighted this was it was a man going up to a door and he'd ring the doorbell and he'd go, "Oh yes, I'd like to ask for Sinead's hand in marriage." The person's like, "Okay, yeah." And then go to the next door, ring the doorbell, ask the same question. So he starts traveling all around the country asking everyone the same question. Just kind of highlight the idea of like, how do you feel if you had to ask 4 million people if you could marry someone? And I think that very much summed up how I felt and how a lot of other people felt at the time, of very much just begging and hoping that the rest of the country would grant us equal marriage because we asked nicely and we have proved ourselves to them. So I think it's important now to talk about some of the measures that still have to be taken to achieve true equality. And I think that many people kind of have this idea of, oh yes, equality for LGBTQ people was achieved in 2015 when the marriage referendum was going on. And since that passed, we've done it. Congratulations, everyone. We did this. Equality is achieved. Homophobia, transphobia, biphobia is no more. And there very much was a slowdown of activism for LGBT people after that. And even within the community, there kind of was a feeling in some groups of, oh yes, well, I have my rights, so that's all that matters. We're done. Nothing else has to be done. But it is very, very naive to say that equality was achieved in 2015, because even other bills and amendments and legislation and legislative pieces were put through since then. It's like there's adoption amendment in 2017 allowing joint adoption for same-sex parents, or in 2019 lesbians who had like a donor-assisted child could both be registered as the child's parent. So on the birth certificate, the non-biological parent can still be recognized as the legal co-parent of this child. Or the Gender Recognition Act was brought in a couple months after the marriage referendum passed, which I'll touch on a bit later. And even this year, there's a lot of legislation that was supposed to go through, and it was in the works, but it kind of fell apart once the Dáil dissolved there at the start of the year. So there is legislation for banning conversion therapy in Ireland, which has fallen through since the Dáil dissolved, along with some bills for school sex ed programs to implement like mandatory discussions on LGBT issues, sexuality, contraception, among a lot of other things that very much would be very important when you're growing up. When you're growing up trying to figure out who you are, it is very important to be able to kind of discuss sexuality and issues about gender and expression and identity and all stuff like that. And also at the end of the day, everything that has been passed since then, a lot of it is just a lot of the acts and amendments that we put in to protect LGBTQ people, they are just words on paper at the end of the day. And for a very clear, simple explanation about how equality is not achieved, you just have to look at hate crime statistics. There are still many hate crimes committed against gay people and especially trans people in the country, and you can't have equality while hate crimes are still going on. They're just incompatible. So while from a governmental point of view, it may look like, oh yes, this is great, there is no more discrimination, but from an actual point of view, from personal experience and other people's experiences, there's still a lot of work that still has to be done. And I think one of the big issues that show a lack of equality that still exists is that mental health in the country is noticeably worse among LGBTQ people. So everything from anxiety to depression to self-harming tendencies and suicide, all of them are disproportionately higher among queer people than among straight cis people. This is kind of especially felt in schools where a lot of people don't feel very accepted. So Belong To is a youth service located all around the country. So in 2019, they underdid a really, really big survey of queer people in school. It was like almost 1,000 people were surveyed for it. And out of that, a majority of them did not feel safe in school. So it's almost 3/4 of people do not feel safe either expressing themselves or being themselves in front of other people, or going to school and feeling like they wouldn't get bullied because they are out. And even today, queer people are still more likely to drop out of school their their like heterosexual cisgender counterparts. So I think it's important to remember the Gender Recognition Act back in 2015. So it is, from a technical point of view, Ireland does have one of the best gender recognition acts in Europe, but it is absolutely woeful in terms of trans healthcare, and it has very, very bad track record for trans-specific healthcare, which for this it can mean everything from hormone replacement therapy to gender affirmation surgeries, even just mental health support and sexual health services. Because these procedures, they aren't just like general procedures to make someone feel better. They are generally life-saving procedures for people. So like even like mental health cases dramatically decrease when trans people are allowed to transition how they want to. So if someone is allowed to go on hormone replacement therapy and get certain surgeries that they want, is completely up to them. And I think that people should respect that, and I don't think that people should be asking them, have you gotten X, Y, and Z? But people that are allowed to do that, the cases for mental health problems dramatically decreases after that. So for many people, this even like suicide rates and self-harming rates dramatically increase. And for those people, these are life-saving surgeries. They are incredibly important procedures that should be done. But Ireland only had one they only had one surgeon that was providing top surgery, and they have since retired. And the country has never had any surgeons for bottom surgery, and this has actually forced a lot of trans people to end up going abroad for other issues. For certain like gender affirmation surgeries, they have to go abroad because there's a complete lack of services here. And even with smaller procedures like hormone replacement therapy, it is incredibly difficult to get onto it. There's a long waiting list for it. And the EU has actually deemed Ireland's trans healthcare to be very unsatisfactory. It is still a lot of work that still has to be done for that. So I'm worried this is getting very long, so I'm going to try and wrap it up quickly. So in conclusion, I think it is very important to recognize the astounding result of the marriage equality referendum. It was a very, very good outcome. It's like to have that big of a majority supporting queer people, although it is very, very naive to also say that equality is now being achieved for queer people because of that. There's clearly a lot of different aspects that still have to be improved, from like hate crimes to attitudes towards queer people to mental health, trans healthcare, to many, many other stuff as well as that. Can't touch on everything now because I want to keep this short and this has already gone on too long, but there's still many aspects that still have to be done before we can achieve true equality in Ireland. And I think that it is important to remember that, because equality is still not reached. There's still a lot more that has to be done. So thanks a million for watching, and I hope that you found this mildly interesting or a little bit informative. So thanks a million.